千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now. To be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process of the Tao. This chapter is known as the Rivers and Oceans chapter, 江海章. And rivers and oceans specifically are named as the kings of 100 valleys, as you see here in the very first line. And what we did previously was that we did that usual sectional analysis using the repeating characters in the original to identify the different sections of this chapter. And we see 4 sections, starting out with a statement on the kings of 100 valleys, the rulers of 100 valleys. This is the most important concept, and it's the same train of thought that goes through the rest of this chapter. So everything about this chapter is using this metaphor, the kings of 100 valleys, the rulers of 100 valleys, which is depicting a Tao-centric kind of leadership. It's a leadership that applies to everyone in all aspects of life, from the home with your family, to the office, to a social setting with your friends, to the community with your neighbors. So definitely leadership is a great value in the Tao, and especially Tao-centric leadership is very specific, and it may not seem to resemble conventional concept of leadership. And that's what we started discussing last time. We got all the way to line 5, so we're going to pick it up from there again. But before that, we will recap with what we talked about previously, especially that central concept about being the ruler of 100 valleys. So that expression, 百谷王, that you see highlighted in red in the original passage, and then singled out for explanation below, this is the focus of this entire chapter. And it's a metaphor because the ancient sages noted that water flows downhill and water from streams flow into rivers. Rivers flow into other rivers, getting increasingly larger, more powerful, until eventually all the rivers empty into the ocean. So it is as if all of these streams and rivers are paying tribute to the larger and more powerful river or the ocean that is situated below them. So this is like subjects paying tribute to the king, or smaller countries paying tribute to the larger and more powerful empire. So that's where that visual metaphor came from. Here, as you can see, it is talking about rivers and oceans can be the kings of 100 valleys because of their goodness in staying low. It's because they're lower that they're able to receive. And that's why they can be the kings of 100 valleys. And staying low, specifically in the Tao, is about the virtue of humility. So we spend quite a bit of time talking about that. And I mentioned that this type of leadership, there's a modern term for that. Servant leadership is a term that is talking about the same kind of paradigm. So here's the summary that we got to last time to talk about the similarities, the usage of the metaphor to apply to a Tao cultivator in a situation where leadership is required. This could be yourself leading or yourself observing a leader at work. Tao-centric leadership is relatively rare in the world. Sometimes there are good people, good leaders who understand the Tao intuitively, and you can see in their actions and words where they are aligned with the Tao. So that's going to be important for us to talk about as well. Alignment in a leader with the Tao, whether yourself or someone that you observe. Here, in this slide that we talked about previously, we're using an image of the ocean to talk about that kind of leadership. The ocean is occupying the lowest position of all, and that's how it receives from all the rivers of the world. And for that, Tao cultivators mean that they will emulate the ocean in being low, that is, adhere to the Tao of humility. The ocean is, we know, incredibly vast. It is not the infinite extent without boundaries of the Tao, but it's something that we can use when we look out onto the vast expanse of the ocean. We can use that as a way to get the mind into thinking about the vastness of the Tao. And when the Tao teachings have expanded your mind, it begins to take on the dimensions of vastness. And eventually, for those who truly master the Tao, it is indeed possible for your mind to understand the infinity of the Tao itself. We know the ocean is incredibly deep. When we map that metaphor to real life, it's about the character of the Tao cultivator, that you will be working on yourself to increase the depth of your knowledge. And yet, all that work may not be obvious to other people. Other people may not realize how much depth you have, how much knowledge you have accumulated, but because you do not have a need to show off, they never find out about it until perhaps one day when they are a little bit taken by surprise by what you know, what you do, what you are able to accomplish. And then the last 2 points there are also important. The ocean is receptive of input from all rivers of the world. This means that a Tao cultivator also has to be receptive. You don't need to agree with all perspectives. You certainly don't need to adopt all different perspectives as your own. But it is important for Tao cultivators to know what the different perspectives are. That is the meaning of being receptive, to be able to understand, although not necessarily identify with, a belief that is different from your own, a perspective that is different from your own. Lastly, perhaps the most important of all, the ocean takes everything, the bad along with the good. It's not just the pristine water from melted snow that goes into the ocean. It is also garbage. It is also sewage that flow into the ocean. So in the Tao, we talk about teachers and resources. This last bullet that you see here on the right-hand side, Tao cultivator is tolerant of all, even the resources. If we say that conventionally, it's going to sound a little bit odd because resources usually aren't something that we think we have to tolerate. The specific meaning in the Tao is that people who are good, they become our teachers. We learn from them, and therefore we love them. But what about people who are bad? Well, most people conventionally would dislike them, perhaps even hate them. What the Tao says is that these people are resources in the sense of being counterexamples. They demonstrate to you what not to do, how not to be. Therefore, in that sense, they are resources that you can learn from. And we should have the same kind of respect for them in that sense as we do for our teachers, because we're learning something from them, and the love that we have for humanity is not something that hopefully will be excluded from some of the people who are not at their best, who are not measuring up to what they can be, what they can potentially become. So tolerance of all, even the resources, those are the bad people in your life. You don't need to put yourself in harm's way or get too close to a source of toxic influence. You can maintain your distance, but to be tolerant is to stop feeling like you have to hate them or oppose them. Hatred is an expenditure of emotional energy that can be best directed at something else, something more productive. Previously, we talked about what it takes to become the king or the ruler of 100 valleys, this metaphor. And first and foremost among them is the term 善下, which means the goodness at being low, at staying low. In other words, the goodness in staying low is the virtue of humility, of being humble. So last time we talked about the way in the Tao to think about being humble. We previously talked about how in the conventional mindset, being humble is seen as the opposite of being arrogant. I wanted to provide another way for you to think about it. If you think about it in terms of a yin and yang symbol or a spectrum, a scale from the extremes, from one extreme to the other, then you can easily identify those extremes in terms of personality. That there are people who are extremely self-deluded about being great. It's an extreme inflation of ego. At the very opposite end of the spectrum, it's not being humble, but that there are people with delusions about being worthless, being self-humiliating all the time, self-degrading, debasing oneself, beating up oneself. That's the true other extreme. When you have that visualization in mind, it's easy to see that being humble is the moderation. It also then makes sense that you can be humble and confident. Being confident is not the opposite of being humble, it's actually one and the same. You can be humble and confident at the same time. It just means that in that state of equilibrium, you are not deluded about yourself being so wonderful and great. There's no extreme inflation of ego. At the same time, you are also not beating up on yourself and thinking that you are worthless. You are neither. Your confidence comes from self-knowledge about what you can do and self-knowledge about what you still don't know. And therefore, that's the paradigm that we use in the Tao. So I want to make sure everyone understands that this idea of being humble is actually very consistent with the Tao of moderation. We then also talked about using I Ching, which is the book of changes. We use that as another way to talk about the Tao of humility, or being humble, being modest, being authentic. I Ching, the book of changes, came from the Tao tradition more than 2,000 years before the time of Lao Tzu. So it's far older than the Tao Te Ching itself. And it's remarkable that there are still such a treasure of wisdom that we can find in every single one of the 64 hexagrams contained in the I Ching. The one that we talked about previously was the 15th. The 15th hexagram is said to be the best one of all, the best among all 64, according to Tao masters and I Ching experts. And in the description, in the poetry describing this particular hexagram, we can see why. The name for this particular hexagram is Qian. And I have the pinyin romanization next to the older Wade-Giles romanization system. So the Q is pronounced like CH, Qian. And the description contains quite a bit more than what you see here. What I've done is that I have singled out 4 lines in the poetic description and translated them to share with everyone. And you can tell where the ancient sages were in terms of their position about this hexagram just by reading these 4 lines. It starts out saying, the Tao of heaven reduces the arrogant and benefits the humble. This is observing the world. This is the ancient sages looking at the world and realizing that no matter what it is in the world, extremes are reduced. And those that are lacking and insufficient gets added to. So in other words, the Tao of heaven is a balancing mechanism. If you have too much arrogance, you're going to be cut down to size. If you don't have enough, you will be added to, you will receive. This plays into the next line. The Tao of earth transforms the arrogant and flows to the humble. Now, as we look around in the world, we see that there's transformation or changes happening all the time, everywhere. This is what the ancient sages have noted as well, so that those who are arrogant will invariably be changed, be transformed, usually by the school of hard knocks, usually by tasting the negative results of their own arrogance. So they will invariably be transformed into something less arrogant, which is in accordance with the first line. And ancient sages also noted that water always will flow to the lowest point. So this is becoming a metaphor for being humble, that water flows to the lowest point, whereas arrogant people tend to want the high ground. That is, they want to climb to the highest place where they can be most visible, the highest profile, highest visibility. Water, the opposite, naturally flows to wherever the lowest place is. And that's the demeanor, and that's the mindset of Tao cultivators, is to feel quite content, to be in the background, to work in the background unnoticed and without the spotlight. It goes on with line 3 to say, demons and deities harm the arrogant and bless the humble. This comes from mythology, legends, and tales where there's endless variations on this theme, where arrogant human beings are punished for their arrogance, whereas the humble become blessed, receive blessings. And that's very much congruent with this whole idea of the lowest place receiving water, water representing goodness, representing life. And in the first line, receiving benefits from heaven itself. So these are very consistent, and stories about demons and deities are reflections of human beings and their own preferences. And that is addressed in the last line. The Tao people dislikes the arrogant and prefers the humble. We see that ourselves as well. We don't need to just rely on the words of the ancient masters. As we look around in life, we know that nobody likes a show off, and people who are humble, people who are receptive, willing to learn, they actually learn the good lessons, the good things. They receive goodness in life. So for all these reasons, this is why I Ching experts all say that this hexagram is the best among all 64. This is because most of the other hexagrams, the other 63 hexagrams, they all contain elements of danger. When you accomplish things in life, accomplishment scales up alongside the risk. This hexagram is the exception. No matter what the situation is in life, if you keep this in mind, 谦, everything will be auspicious. The situation becomes smooth and easy. So remember, being humble is not self-degradation, self-debasement. It's about being confident, but also realizing where you still need to learn. It's about being hard on yourself, but being easy with others. It is about not satisfied with where you are at and going with the flow in terms of your tendency, your desire to improve yourself. It is a kind of respect to the world and to reality, to existence. So all of the above is the reasons why the sages have such a revered opinion of this particular hexagram, the 15th from the Tao Te Ching, from the I Ching, pardon me, and incorporated into the Tao Te Ching as the main concept in chapter 66. So we had enough to then go to the one of 4 leadership style comparisons. So the bottom part of the slide that we talked about last time is drawn from the first part of 66, the first 3 lines. And we have to the left and to the right a comparison between a leadership style that is contrary to the Tao and a leadership style that is aligned with the Tao. For the alignment, the metaphor used is the king of 100 valleys because of staying low. So the opposite of that, in contrary to the Tao, the conventional way is to see the leader as the peak of the mountain instead of the low-lying ocean. The peak of the mountain is the highest and most visible from a great distance, whereas the king of 100 valleys is the lowest and most humble. So this is why conventional concept of leadership is the commander, whereas the Tao concept of leadership is to be the servant, is to be helpful and supportive. So the conventional leader, contrary to the Tao, is the one giving orders to everybody. The Tao concept of the leader is the one who receives contributions from all. And this is because none of us is good at everything. We all need one another to advance in life. We all bring different skills, different talents, different gifts to any venture. So the Tao-centric leader understands that and is receiving contributions in terms of what you can bring to the table from everybody. So in terms of power, I say that the contrary to the Tao, leadership style is power-based because the conventional leader is one who hoards personal power, whereas the Tao-centric leader is the one who harnesses the collective power. With all the contributions from everyone, the group or the team is very powerful, very capable. That group working harmoniously can move mountains. And it's up to the Tao-centric leader to harness that and direct it in a way that benefits everybody. So we got to the point in talking about being humble. There's a specific passage that talks about speaking humbly, that the greatest leader is the one who speaks the most humbly to people. And this is where we got to last time. And I wasn't able to finish discussing this slide because there's so much to talk about from my personal experience. So now I would like to spend some time with you on this slide to further share with you some thoughts from my own personal journey on the path. Years ago, when I began studying seriously, it didn't take long for me to encounter ideas about the Tao in the West that were simply wrong. Some could be figured out just with common sense. The rest I knew because I was rooted in a very authentic tradition of the Tao, and I had the ability to read and understand ancient Chinese. So literally, ancient Chinese was like an open book to me. Reflecting on that, I could see the distortions and the misconceptions. At that time, it was important for me to practice the Tao correctly. So when I encounter things that were wrong, I usually would not hesitate to try to set the record straight. So just a small handful of examples. I hear people pronouncing Tao, the Tao of this or that, Taoism, Taoist, and I would not hesitate to say that, well, it's actually Tao with a D sound, not a T sound. It's a common misunderstanding, and again, because of the old Wade-Giles romanization system that caused the misconception in the first place. There are many such examples in the spoken English today. A familiar term, Kung Fu, actually originally in Chinese, even today, Gong Fu with a G sound. The Wade-Giles system depicted the G sound with the letter K with a notation that should be pronounced unaspirated, which means G. So it really was supposed to sound like Gung Fu, but academics back in those days, and even today, were simply not very good at explaining the linguistic system, so the public had no idea. Today, Kung Fu is a well-accepted term. It's a well-accepted mistake. There are things like that in both sides of the cultural barrier. There are many terms in English that are mistranslated into Chinese, and the mistake has taken root. So with the Tao, it still is that. It is not Tao. And then I hear about Lao Tzu being the founder of Taoism. And actually, it began, as I mentioned, more than 2,000 years before his time. I Ching is proof of that. So you could figure out with common sense that he could not be the founder of Taoism unless you accept the impossibility of him traveling back in time, which of course did not occur. And then there's also, I remember one time receiving a very angry email to explain to me that Lao Tzu means "oh son" or "oh child." No, it's not. It's just old master. There are many passages in the Tao Te Ching that contain multiple layers of meaning, but the name Lao Tzu, it has no multiple layers of meaning. It's just old master. That's it. And then Hua Hu Jing is said to be the final teaching of Lao Tzu. No, it's a forgery. There's an ancient version of that was totally made up, and also a modern version that is also completely made up. The latter is available for purchase today, written specifically to appeal to Western ideas about the Tao. It's also made up. Now, when I talked about this, I would use very harsh terms. Actually, that's not true. You're wrong about that. That's a misconception. That's just your hang-up. These are manifestations of the ego. Ironically, I wanted to study the Tao because I knew that ego or arrogance was always my greatest challenge in life. So the study of the Tao actually contributed to that until much later on, as I reflect on chapter 66 of the Tao Te Ching, that I was wrong. Now, what I said was correct, but I did not understand that it was more important for the Tao to be helpful to people, to be proceeding in a way that can be gentle and yet wise and helpful to others. And when I talk about hang-ups here, I had seen people, for instance, who talked about, hey, the Tao is not self-help, or the to-do list is against the Tao. These are hang-ups due to negative experience with those things. And for instance, I know that there's elements in the self-help movement in modern times that are phony and downright harmful to the people that subscribe to them. That doesn't mean that the Tao cannot be self-help. The Tao is everything. It includes all the stuff that are resources that people dislike. And self-help, well, there are elements in the Tao that are wisdom to help you improve yourself. So you can definitely, legitimately call that self-help as well. And in the process of doing that, there's nothing to prevent you from using a to-do list to help you track things. It's not against the Tao. It can be used improperly to cause you a lot of stress, but that's where the personal hang-up comes from. Now, when I talk about that, I am not facing a receptive audience. When people hear me use these terms that are not quite the Tao, their defenses go up, shields up. After that, there's not going to be anything more that they will hear. In a similar way, when I discussed translation with other people, and they might say, oh, you know, so-and-so has a translation that's beautiful and superior. And I'll say, well, you're not really qualified to judge because you don't really know the original language. I'll say, you have no idea. Okay, I may be right, but how likely is it that people will believe what I say? They are much more likely to reject what I say because I put them on the defensive. So all of these phrases on the left-hand side, not quite the Tao, they are good for creating enemies. They are good for alienating people. So what I did in studying the Tao, and in my mind, defending its truth, was actually not quite the Tao. That's the point I wanted to make. What would be closer to the Tao? Well, there are many expressions that are much more gentle, lighter, softer, and therefore closer to the Tao. these are ways that we can moderate our language as to not be so harsh as it was. For instance, to the best of my knowledge, it is so and so. As far as I am aware, this is how it is. And then similar phrases include, if I recall correctly, it was such and such that took place. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that this and that. And you hear this sometimes from public figures. For instance, comedian Dennis Miller ends his monologues with, I could be wrong. And this was a good way to moderate the opinion that he expressed with a particular topic. And then it's just a thought. And this is used by a YouTube personality, Bo of the Sixth Column. He'll end every video with anyhow, just a thought, you'll have a good day. And this is yet another way to be more graceful, to be more open to the possibility that, hey, listen, I think I'm right, but I'm not always right. I recognize that I, like other human beings, am rather imperfect, that we all fall short of the ideal of absolute perfection. Now, in the history of the United States, one of the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, was known for being a skillful diplomat. When he reflected on the success that he had throughout his life and how he was welcomed everywhere, he expressed that indeed he used these expressions, that he was careful to express himself in a way that left room for other people to breathe. He said, I never use anything that may possibly be disputed, like words such as certainly, undoubtedly, any words that give the air of positiveness to an opinion. And then he continued, rather, I would say, I conceive or apprehend a thing to be so and so, or it appears to me, or I should think it so and so for such and such reasons, or I imagine it to be so, or it is so if I am not mistaken. You see the alignment there. You see that he already intuitively understood that the Tao means to speak humbly. So that's what I did not do in the beginning of my journey. It's what I am now trying to do always, whether in speaking with you or speaking in everyday living to anyone that I come across. So that's part of my personal journey that I wanted to share with you. And I hope that you found something in it that may be helpful to you as well. And I have, I think, one last one here. It seems, it appears, it looks like, and this is very much in accordance of what Benjamin Franklin had explained. Now, let's go back to the Tao Te Ching and explore more lines. See if we can find some additional wisdom. Line 6, in reference to the sages, if they wish to be in front of people. So the expression here, 鲜明, we have the pinyin there, and then we have the sounds like, because the pinyin romanization system, like the previous Wei Jiao system, is also rather imperfect. And of course, it's created by human beings, and we human beings are imperfect. So the literal meaning of these two characters, the first one is ahead, in front of, And then the second one is people. Citizens, subjects in ancient kingdoms, citizens in modern times. So just people. So putting them together is to take a leading position ahead of people, having people follow you as you move ahead. And the difference is when people take a leading position, they may do so for ego gratification. Look at me, follow me, I know best. Everyone should be behind me and follow me wherever I go. The sages, on the other hand, they may wish to lead for the greater good, and usually they're asked to lead. They would not assume, they would not presume that they have everyone's support to lead, and therefore most of the time they will be just working in the background. But then there may come a time when people say, we really need you to go ahead of us so that we can follow you. In that case, the sage will lead for the greater good. Next line, line 7. Again, in reference to the sages, they must place themselves behind them, behind people. The sages must place themselves behind people. So to be behind means to support people. Specifically, it means to help, to motivate people, to prepare them, to encourage them. So this is not a strange expression because we have similar expressions in modern times. We say, hey, listen, I'm behind you 100%, meaning I support you. And we also have expressions like, look, I got your back. And what we're trying to say is that, look, you can move forward without worries because I'm behind you 100% and I got your back. If necessary, I will give you a push when needed. So the purpose of the sage is to have people make progress. The people understand that and appreciate it. And sages see the success of the people or the group as their own success. And I want to tell you a true story. Just from recently, there's an organization that I know with hundreds of employees. Every year, this organization does an annual awards event, an awards ceremony to recognize outstanding employees. So there are dozens of categories, employee of the year, department of the year, many, many more categories. And when people gather together to go through the ceremony at this event, they applaud all the employees who are recognized. This one time, quite by surprise, a name was mentioned. When that name was mentioned, it's a rank and file employee. That person received the loudest, longest applause from everyone. And that employee wasn't even nominated for anything. He was just being mentioned as part of a narrative in that event. Who was he? Why was there the loudest and longest applause for him? What was his contribution? Well, it's actually an employee who worked in tech support. It's a tech support person. Everybody cheered for him. Even though he wasn't nominated, they didn't care. The reason they cheered was because over the years, he has been helping everyone. He's behind them. He's supportive of them. He's got their back. Whenever he did so, he was always positive and cheerful. He was always helpful. And because of that, everybody knew that and appreciated him. So this is like what we're talking about here. Now, this particular tech support person has not been pushed to the front to lead, but I do see a bright future ahead of him because his actions are in alignment with the Tao. Okay, so having talked about that, I just want to go over a couple of interpretations of this line, and then we will take our break for the meeting. So sometimes I encounter the following incorrect interpretation. This is a technique to advance yourself in an organization. You start in the back, but end up in front. So this is like a trick, a clever trick that you can use for yourself. That would be the incorrect interpretation. Let me share the correct interpretation of this line. Sages put people first, themselves last in supporting them. That's why they're taking up a position behind the people. Therefore, they are oftentimes the best choice to lead because they're not motivated by power. They're motivated by serving, helping, supporting people. One thing that I want to point out is that this concept is a reiteration of a similar expression previously in the Tao of Jing, from Tao of Jing, chapter 7, or verse 7 if you prefer. That particular verse has these two lines, line 5 and line 6. Therefore, the sages place themselves last but end up in front. So this is very similar to line 6 and 7 in this chapter. If they, the sages, wish to be in front of people, they must place themselves behind them. So both chapters express the same idea. The interpretation is the same. The sages are selfless in placing themselves last. They put other people ahead of them. So that means, quite naturally, when people have an opportunity to select their own leader, they are likely to choose the person who has given them the most support in the past. So this gives us another basis for comparison. We can compare leadership styles that's contrary to the Tao, symbolized by the peak of the mountain, and leadership style that is aligned with the Tao, symbolized by the king of 100 valleys. In other words, the rivers and oceans. So the conventional leader, power-based leader, assumes authority over everyone. So that is the mindset of being above people. The mindset of the leader aligned with the Tao is the opposite, provides a foundation of support. How can I serve? How can I be most helpful? How may I assist? The conventional leader has a tendency to talk down to those they lead, those who follow, talks down to people. A Tao-centric leader will be the opposite, would speak humbly at everyone's level. So no fancy expressions, no technical jargon, speaking plainly, humbly, in a way that everyone can understand. No patronizing, condescending expressions. The conventional leader would put himself or herself front and center because that's the focus of attention. That is the high profile, high visibility position, and it appeals to the ego. A Tao-centric leader, very different, would not be front and center of his own accord, but instead will be happy to provide motivation from the back, provide helpful preparation and encouragement from the back rather than the front. The conventional leader expects people to follow orders, my way or the highway type of mentality. Whereas from the back, from behind, the Tao leader encourages people to move forward, gives them what they need to motivate themselves to move ahead. So this is definitely a contrast between what Lao Tzu sees as good leadership and what we usually see in the world. We're now ready to go to the next section. Line 8. Thus, the sages are positioned above. Let's talk about that. So we talked about how sages prefer to be among people rather than in front of them. And to be positioned above is like being in front. It's also a way to talk about being in a leadership position above other people. So when the sages accept a position of leadership above other people, they do so in a way that is not going to be burdensome to the people who are being led. So let's look at the process. Historically, sages throughout all different dynasties have been sought out by the kings or emperors for advice. And this is because the rulers in that period may want leadership tips and strategies. How do I lead? And the sages can provide what they know based on the Tao of leadership. And other times, they're asked by the people to take up that responsibility. If they agree, it will only be with an orientation to serve, the service mentality. They will be thinking that I can best serve the interest of everyone if I provide leadership services. So it's thinking about leadership as yet another service to provide to people. To inform people, educate people, to support them, prepare them, and to lead them as one of the many services provided by the sage. Line 9. Although the sages are positioned above, the people do not feel burdened. This is because oftentimes in a conventional setting with the typical leader, people oftentimes do feel burdened by the leadership above. The sage's mindset makes all the difference in the world. And this is because whereas a conventional leader, power-based leader, may be demanding praise and obedience and loyalty and also validation for what they do, sages are different. They have no requirements for external validation. They are validated from self-knowledge and by following the principles of the Tao. They don't need to look to external sources for what can be an illusory validation. And that means they require no praise, no applause, no public adulation. They may end up with praise and applause and public adulation, but they don't have any requirements in that regard. And sometimes it is because they don't have that ego that needs to be fed, that requires feeding, that is the reason why they receive praise and applause and adulation. So they don't make any unreasonable demands from people. What they demand from the people is what the people would all agree is what they should do. And the sages will not phrase it or make it like a demand. Instead, they would make sure the people understand what the objectives are. The clarity of that vision will be the motivating factor. It doesn't need to be demanded. It can be shown to the people, and people end up demanding from themselves. So Let's take a look at the next two lines together. They're very similar to the previous two lines. Previous two lines talk about when the sages are above, the people are not burdened. Now we talk about what happens when they're in front. People do not feel harmed. So to be in front, of course, as we talked about, is to lead the way. You go ahead, you pick the path, we follow you. Therefore, the responsibility is to choose the best path for everyone to follow. Where are we going as a group? What should we do for a better future? That's the path to follow that I'm talking about. So the people being led, they have trust in the sage's judgment because the sage is wise, informed by the Tao and ancient wisdom. The people know that the sage will not lead them down a path that turns out to be harmful for everyone, a bad decision, a bad choice. So this is the end of the third section, and this gives us yet another basis for comparing leadership style. So the third comparison, again, it's the peak of the mountain, the king of 100 valleys, the high versus the low. Let's take a look at the leadership style contrary to the Tao. Conventional power-based leader demands loyalty and obedience, whereas the Tao leader makes no unreasonable demands. The conventional leader becomes a burden to the people, and easiest way to see this is when you have in ancient history periods of time when there's heavy taxation. That's a burden to the people and contributes to luxuries enjoyed by the ruler. Rather than to be a burden to the people, a Tao-centric style of leadership is an inspiration to the people, and this is done by providing a vision of how we can be. Look at what we need to do to accomplish our goals. That inspires people, so they come together, they join together to work on that goal. Next, the conventional leader usually prioritizes self-interest. It's about self-dealing, lining his or her own pockets, self-interest above all. Whereas the Tao-centric leadership is the opposite, prioritizes everyone's best interest ahead of the leader's own. And you can see this every day when you, for instance, look at someone who's a great mom. She is prioritizing the children's best interests ahead of her own. And she may be making many sacrifices to advance the children's best interests. So that is actually a very natural manifestation of a Tao-oriented style of leadership. And as we talked about in the previous slide, the conventional leader, because of glory, pursuit of glory for oneself, can lead everybody down a harmful path. That is, the path that has benefits to one person, but a lot of problems and trouble for everybody. The Tao-centric leader is the opposite. The leadership there would be leading toward a better future for all. It's a win-win scenario. So that is the third comparison of different leadership styles. And as you can see, definitely continues to be quite a contrast. So let's continue with the Tao Te Ching. We're now on line 12. Line 12 says, thus, the world is glad to push them forward without resentment. So this is a reference to the previous line where the sage is in the back. And the world is glad to push them forward. They end up in the front, and yet they are in the front without harm. They are above without burden, and therefore the people feel no resentment toward them. Indeed, they are happy to have good, enlightened leadership, one that works for everybody. So let's go ahead and break down this line here. We do this with some of the lines, not all of them, but occasionally it's beneficial. So the first two characters together is where you get the therefore, thus, or so. And then the next two characters literally below heaven, and that's usually translated as the world or everybody in the world. And then we have a single character here. The fifth character is glad or happy. Then we have the character following that, tui, it means to push. And then we have a connected word, which can be and. And then we have the negation word, bu, which means no or not. And then the last character here is just resent or resentment. So below heaven means everybody or all people below heaven. You can string this together. Therefore, everybody is glad to push the sage forward without resentment. That's basically what it says. This means that a leader with the qualities of a sage would enjoy widespread support. People push them ahead without resenting their leadership. And this is because people know power would not corrupt such a person. Such a person lives by the Tao principle, will do what's best for everybody and not be corrupted by power, which is extremely easy to do and is seen all the time throughout history. And therefore, they push him or her into a leadership position, but historically, this kind of leader is the rarest of all, extremely rare. And in other places of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu also talks about how an even higher level of leader is one that people don't even know that they have. Next line. Line 13 says, because they do not contend. So this is getting us to the last, perhaps most important concept associated with the king of 100 valleys. Do not contend, non-contention. The final and most important attribute of the Tao leader is non-contention. This is because a leader of the Tao has no interest in games of domination, no interest in arguments or debates. Discussions are always welcome, but when it gets into debates or arguments, it becomes heated, it becomes angry, and therefore useless. A leader of the Tao will also promote harmony within the group. So this is part of non-contention, is to bring the peace and bring the harmony. And that's done by seeking common ground and peaceful coexistence, that everybody can get along together as a group. So there's quite a bit that we need to talk about when it comes to non-contention. So this particular chapter, we're going to get into the concept that non-contention starts when the sage is not looking to pick a fight. They do not contend, and therefore other people do not contend against them. They have no need to prove themselves. So let's take a closer look. So what is the Tao of non-contention? As you guys have already seen, we've gone through a couple of examples to think in the Tao paradigm, where being humble is not seen as the opposite of being arrogant, but as the Tao of moderation, moderation between two extremes. Here, we have a similar situation where people may think of contention and non-contention as yin and yang, or on a spectrum, like this. On one side, you've got contention, fight, arguments, battles, war, friction. To the right, you've got non-contention, peace and harmony. And on a spectrum, it will look like this. To the left, contention. To the right, non-contention. To the left, warfare. To the right, peace. So that seems to make sense. But then, what will be the balance between the two? Like a little bit of contention, a mixture of peace and harmony? That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Is there a better way that we can represent that? What is the Tao paradigm? How can we think about it? As you have seen from our previous examples, we have a way to represent this yin and yang in a way that makes more sense. So let's take a look at how that can look. So the real extremes on the one end is the aggressive provocation of conflict. Someone who's provoking a fight. And what is the opposite end of the extreme? The true opposite is the extreme fear and avoidance of conflict. So those are the real extremes. Let's go ahead and lay them out. Provoking conflict, fearing conflict, and on a spectrum, it's going to look like this in a similar way, where provoking conflict, being very warlike, is on the left-hand side, and fearing conflict, the cowardly side, is the extreme on the right-hand side. Then you can easily put non-contention in the middle as the moderation between the two. So non-contention, the peace of the Tao of peace is not necessarily synonymous with pacifism. Non-contention being the point of moderation, it isn't fearing conflicts, it isn't cowardice, but it is also not warlike. It is in between, capable of defending itself when being attacked. Of course, the wise Tao cultivator and Tao sages will only see that as a last resort. But some of the most skillful and powerful warriors from Chinese history have been dedicated students of the Tao. This is how they see non-contention. Although they're skillful and powerful in the art of battle, they do not fear conflict, but they also do not provoke conflict. They are non-contentious. So this is the way to see non-contention that makes all the sense in the world. So next line. The world cannot contend with them. So the sage, as we have talked about, is naturally peaceful and harmonious. When someone is naturally peaceful and harmonious, genuinely peaceful and harmonious, it has a powerful effect on everyone around that person. Everybody around the sage is feeling the effects of that peace and harmony and become more peaceful and harmonious themselves. So others have no reason to pick a fight or be aggressive. There's not going to be any reason for battle. Instead of contention, a Tao-centric leader focuses on building relationships. So it's all about alliance and partnership. It's all about working together. So the basic idea is simple. Separately, we are alone, weaker, and oftentimes lost and confused. Together, we are stronger, wiser, and we can get much more done for everyone's benefit. So this puts us into position to do the last leadership style comparison, and this is based on the fourth section, the last section in chapter 66. So contrary to the Tao, the peak of the mountain pushes people out of the way, pushes people in order to put oneself in the front, whereas the Tao-centric leader accepts popular requests to lead, and that's where in the Tao Te Ching it says people push the sage forward without resentment. So the resentment part for the conventional power-based leader, it's definitely very much present. We see this all the time. The bad boss, the bad manager, the bad leader resented by the people who follow or have no choice but to follow. Much resentment. Whereas the Tao-centric leader welcomed, not resented by the people. So just by looking at the first two bullets for the leader that's contrary to the Tao, the power-based leader, pushing people out of the way, get out of my way, resented by the people taking power, contentious by nature. Whereas the Tao-centric leader practices non-contention, always. Because of the contention on the part that is contrary to the Tao, it causes damage to relationships. So this is the reason why when people have a bad boss or bad manager, they can't wait to find an opportunity to leave. At the first opportunity to get away, they take it. They move into another job. They transition to another company. They put their resume out in the job marketplace, hoping to find a good opportunity to get away. People can't wait to get away from a bad leader. On the Tao-centric side, brings people together. This is where the group, the team, the group becomes more of a team and the team becomes more of a family. And there's ties that bind people together to one another. So even when a task is done and the group is disbanded, people miss the time that they spend together, working together on a common objective. And they probably tried to do reunions, every now and then, just to relive those memories of good times. And that's how powerful the Tao-aligned leadership can be. So now that we're done with the last comparison of leadership styles, we can sum everything together. We can use a graphic here. I want to bring everything we have learned together into a symbolic diagram that uses the mental imagery, which is streams flowing into a river, to depict the various elements that flow into the Tao of relationship. So first, you start with rivers and oceans, the kings of 100 valleys at the bottom. So symbolically depicted as a flowing river from left to right. So one stream that flows into it is humility, being humble, staying low. So this is where the Tao leader practices the goodness in staying low, the Tao of humility, not just to understand the concept of humility intellectually, but actually integrate it into every thought, every action. It's as I mentioned, my primary purpose for studying the Tao is to be humble, is to become more humble. It's a lifelong challenge for me, and I know it's probably a challenge for many people as well. So second one, the second stream that flows into the river, speak humbly. So I shared my personal experience in the early years of studying the Tao with everyone because I wanted to make this point. Being right is important, but it's not as important as following the Tao and helping people. Rather than to assert myself in a righteous way, instead, I want to provide the correct information only when people are ready for it, only when they ask for it, they want it. I want to do that instead of beating them over the head with correct information. What good will that do? Well, from my experience, not much at all. So speak humbly is the second stream that feeds into this river. The third stream is listen to understand. So think about this. The conventional leader wants to be understood. The conventional power-based leader complains about being misunderstood. The Tao leader is the opposite. The Tao leader seeks to understand first. Now, the best way to do that is the practice of empathy, is to listen, to hear what people have to say, to see where they're coming from. Even if you disagree with them, you owe it to them to sample their perspective, to understand why they feel the way they feel. The fourth stream that feeds into the river is providing support to everybody. Sages win respect not through some sort of a powerful, commanding presence, but they do so, they win respect by providing spiritual support, spiritual sustenance, and this is extended to everybody. And yet another stream that flows into it, inspire, not coerce. And here specifically, what I mean is that most of the time, there's simply no need to force anyone to do anything against their will. Even if you get people to comply, that compliance will be transient at best. It's far better to inspire, encourage, evangelize, give people clarity so they want to do what is right without being ordered or commanded to do so. So that's yet another stream that feeds into the river. Then we have this stream, minimize contention. So what we talked about is that the truly skillful ruler has no need for contention, no need for violence. Contention is toxic, and it can be easily avoided for those who have no interest in pushing, shoving, and stepping on other people to get to the front or to get to the top. And lastly, one final stream that flows into it, maximize relationships. The Tao of leadership is about connecting on a personal level, making friends, strengthening relationships. Your team is your family is your team. Build a community. As I said, we are weaker and often lost when we're alone. We become stronger and wiser when we are together. So these are the streams that feed into the river, the king of 100 valleys. So this concludes our discussion of Tao Te Ching, chapter 66. We're out of time, so we need to go to the summary. And next time, we will do the paraphrase and the full circle discussions. So today, we have talked about some pretty important contrasts in leadership styles aligned with the Tao. The first, remember, is about being modest, authentic, being humble, to be the lowest and the most humble, to be the servant, and therefore receive contributions from everyone so that you can harness all that power. Two, in the second comparison, we have the idea of providing foundational support from the bottom to speak humbly at everyone's level, not talk down to them, provide motivation, encouragement from the back. And this encourages people to move forward. So that's the second idea from the second section. From section 3, no burden, no harm. This is because Tao-centric leadership makes no unreasonable demands. Becoming an inspiration to the people, prioritizing everyone's best interests, leading toward a better path that is a better future and not something that will be harmful to anyone. Rather, it will be a win-win situation for everybody. And lastly, what we just talked about, number 4, peaceful, harmonious. And this is when the leader is accepting a request to lead and therefore is welcome. Does not need to push people aside to lead, practices non-contention, which builds relationships, brings people together. So these are the 4 separate comparisons that you saw throughout our discussion today. We're going to line them up in a summary. The king of 100 valleys, how to become that king, that ruler. Well, it's about the Tao leader. Stay low to be modest and authentic. This is just a reiteration of what we have already covered because this is a summary. Number 2, speak humbly in assisting people. Number 3, there's no need to burden people and you do not want to lead them to harm. Instead, lead with wisdom and lead with a light touch. Number 4, no contention. Do not contend against anyone. These are the ingredients that make up the Tao leader. The visualization for that, as you see in the graphic to the right, it's streams in the valley flowing into rivers, and the river in turn flowing into the ocean. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.